Hello and welcome to Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. I'm Ian Masters, and today we'll look into a number of stories and issues in the news. We'll begin with Secretary of Defense Hegseth digging the hole deeper as he sat beside a half-awake Trump in a round-robin exercise in flattery of the dear leader cabinet meeting yesterday, spouting rapid-fire, "the dog ate my homework" excuses for not committing a war crime. Joining us to discuss how Trump and MAGA's policies and politics are driven by sadism is Paul Waldman, a journalist and opinion writer whose work has appeared in dozens of newspapers, magazines, and digital outlets, including the Los Angeles Times, the Boston Globe, Chicago Tribune, The Week, MSNBC, and CNN. He's a former columnist at the Washington Post, and his books include Being Right Is Not Enough, What Progressives Must Learn from Conservative Success, The Press Effect, Politicians, Journalists, and the Stories That Shape the Political World, and most recently, White Rural Rage, The Threat to American Democracy. He runs the cross-section on Substack, where his latest article we will discuss is A Few Bad Men. Then we'll examine Putin's warning of going to war with Europe, after which the Russian dictator promised there would be no one left to negotiate with, and speak with Michael Kimmage, director of the Kennan Institute, who is a professor of history and department chair at the Catholic University of America. From 2014 to 2017, he served on the Secretary's policy planning staff at the United States Department of State, where he held the Russia-Ukraine portfolio. He's the author of The Abandonment of the West, A History of an Idea in American Foreign Policy, and Collisions, The War in Ukraine and the Origins of a New Global Instability. And he has a recent article at Foreign Policy, Europe is at War. Then finally, we'll speak with Sarah Lee Whitson, the executive director of Dawn, an organization that seeks to support democracy and human rights in the Middle East. She was formerly the executive director of Human Rights Watch's Middle East and North Africa division, where she oversaw work in 19 countries. Her latest book with Michael Omar Mann, just out, is From Apartheid to Democracy, a blueprint for peace in Israel-Palestine. And we'll explore the possibility of peace between Israelis and Palestinians in spite of the ongoing atrocities in Gaza, where there is supposed to be a peace process underway. And before we begin, for over a decade, we have warned that Trump is both a criminal and likely a traitor, not to mention he's mentally unstable, egomaniacal, woefully ignorant, wildly incompetent, insatiably greedy, and corrupt. Now it should be clear to all that his chaotic misrule must be ended as soon as possible, and until that happens, Background Briefing will continue to investigate and expose MAGA criminality and cruelty. But more importantly, explore strategies and popular movements to bring about regime change as quickly as possible, to restore democracy and civility, and stop the systematic destruction of the United States at home and its standing abroad. To help sustain us with public broadcasting and freedom of the press itself under assault as Trump's billionaire buddies buy up the mainstream media, you can make a tax-deductible donation to our nonprofit foundation, the Public Truth Media Foundation, at publictruthmedia.org or at backgroundbriefing.org/donate. And thank you. And joining us now is Paul Waldman, a journalist and opinion writer whose work has appeared in dozens of newspapers, magazines, and digital outlets, including the Los Angeles Times, the Boston Globe, the Chicago Tribune, The Week, MSNBC, and CNN. He is a former columnist at the Washington Post, and his books include Being Right Is Not Enough, What Progressives Must Learn from Conservative Success, The Press Effect, Politicians, Journalists, and the Stories That Shape the Political World, and most recently, White Rural Rage, The Threat to American Democracy. And he runs the cross-section on Substack, where his latest article is A Few Bad Men. Welcome to Background Briefing, Paul Waldman.
Thank you, Ian.
Well, thanks for joining us. And of course, the title of your article, A Few Bad Men, is play on the movie A Few Good Men, where Jack Nicholson, of course, was a character somewhat similar to Pete Hegseth. He's being charged with a war crime, and the JAG attorney prosecuting him, played by Tom Cruise, is confronting him. And of course, the famous line comes from Jack Nicholson, where he says, "You can't handle the truth." And that sort of resonates, I think, with people who saw that movie. So I guess my question would be, Paul, where is the Tom Cruise in this current situation?
Well, unfortunately, Pete Hegseth is not yet on trial, although someday he may be. But the reason I use that as a device to kind of get into a discussion of this is because I think that Hegseth probably thinks that Jack Nicholson's character, Colonel Jessup, is the hero, but he's not. He's the villain. When he says you can't handle the truth that he's trying to argue for is that rules and laws are just impediments to what needs to be done. And we need violent men like him who are willing to break those laws, including in the movie, he orders a young soldier to be killed because he thinks he's not competent enough to be up to the job. And his argument is that that's what's necessary. That violent men like him who disobey the law are necessary in order to keep the rest of us safe. And the whole point is that that's not true. That we have laws, not because we think that it's going to compromise our own safety, but because that's what it means to live in a democracy, and that's ultimately what keeps us safe. And so, this whole thing with the strikes against these boats in the Caribbean, and I guess in the Pacific also, their argument, the Trump administration and the Department of Defense, is basically trust us. We have the right to do this. We're not going to tell you what evidence we have that these people are actually transporting drugs. And even if they were transporting drugs, what they were doing would be against the law. But their argument is, it doesn't matter. We're going to kill them because we've decided that they're a threat and we can do whatever we want. The laws of war don't matter. American law doesn't matter. And in this case of this double strike that happened on this one boat, I mean, that is not only a violation of international law, which says that if somebody is no longer a threat, you're not allowed to attack them. It's actually written into American law. There's a document called the Law of War Manual that the Defense Department puts out where it specifically talks about this situation as a case in which it would be where service members have an obligation to refuse an order like that. And I can quote you from it. It says, the requirement to refuse to comply with orders to commit law of war violations applies to orders to perform conduct that is clearly illegal or orders that the subordinate knows in fact are illegal. For example, orders to fire upon the shipwrecked would be clearly illegal. And that's what they did in this case. There were a couple of guys who were clinging to the wreckage of that boat, and they went ahead and killed them. And so now we're arguing about whose responsibility it really is and who gave the order and who knew about it. But the fact is that the whole operation that they're conducting is illegal. And the argument from Hegseth and Trump is that we don't care. We do what we want. We kill who we want. And that's just the right that we have.
Well, do you think, Paul, that the Democrats who made that video, Mark Kelly and Lisa Slotkin and others, knew about this war crime violation in advance of doing the video, which in that case would make Mark Kelly the Tom Cruise character, right?
Yeah, I haven't seen anything that they knew about this particular strike, but obviously they knew about these strikes because the Trump administration has been bragging about them and has been releasing the exciting videos of the explosions to the media. And so I'm certain that they knew that this whole operation is against the law, and just the larger principle that it is highly likely that Donald Trump either has or at some point will give illegal orders to members of the military. And Pete Hegseth has basically made his career, and I argue is the Secretary of Defense, because he has been arguing for years that American service members in the American military should no longer obey things like the Geneva Conventions and any kinds of laws of war. He got really on Trump's radar. I mean, obviously, he was on Trump's radar because he was the weekend co-host of Fox and Friends, and Trump watches impossible amounts of Fox. So I'm sure he knew him from there. But when he really got in front of Trump, it was because when he was advocating for a group of men who had either been convicted or accused of war crimes, including killing civilians. And they had been somewhere in jail, in one case of a guy named Eddie Gallagher, who by all accounts could only be described as a serial killer. His entire unit turned him in, his Navy SEAL unit, which is an extraordinary thing to happen. And they described how he just killed civilians for fun all the time. And Pete Hegseth was advocating for him and convinced Trump to restore his rank and convinced him to pardon other people who had been accused of war crimes. And so he was lobbying Trump, and that's how I think that he really got in front of Trump, and Trump started to think about the possibility of him leading the Department of Defense. So, this goes back to to the beginning of this administration and everything about their philosophy about how the United States should conduct itself when it comes to war.
Well, I think Trump bought into this macho nonsense that this guy spouts, that somehow or rather the Department of Defense has become a colony of woke wusses, and that what the country needs is to purge the DoD of the women and the minorities and bring back the white men with crusader tattoos, the real patriots. I mean, I don't know whether you saw Hegseth yesterday at the cabinet meeting where Trump was dozing off next to him. He was just babbling like a madman. I mean, in terms of their recruiting these guys because of their blind loyalty, I understand that part. But my God, I mean, you look at this guy, and then and then the other guy at the head of the FBI has got this sort of deer in the headlights look. Both of them are so clearly out of their depth that they exhibit all of that insecurity that people have when they know they're not up for the job. That seems to be the subtext here.
Yeah, I think so. And Hegseth has a kind of belligerence that I think he knows that Trump values. That whenever he's questioned, he attacks the people who are questioning him. And you're right that his whole philosophy is that the military has gotten soft and it needs to basically go back to the time when it was just white men in positions of leadership. He has undertaken a real purge of women and non-white people in the positions of power, especially flag officers. He wrote a book called The War on Warriors: Behind the Betrayal of the Men Who Kept Us Free. And the point of the whole book is that we've gotten soft. We keep obeying these things like the Geneva Conventions, and we need to just improve our quote unquote lethality. Now, you'll notice that the subtitle refers to the men who keep us free. There are 225,000 women currently serving in the military, and thousands of them are in combat units. And even the ones who are not in combat units do really important things. And it's funny because he has this kind of outdated view of, what he calls war fighters. Well, the truth is that most of the people in the military, most of the things that the military does are not about, putting bullets in people's heads. They are things like logistics and cyber defense. And that's what the military runs on. And yes, the military needs people who shoot guns, but it also needs computer programmers. And they are both equally important. But in Hegseth's mind, none of that stuff that is not, big, strong guys shooting guns and killing people, none of that stuff matters. And, we had this extraordinary scene of him gathering every flag officer in the military to Virginia to kind of lecture them on how they were a bunch of wimps and we need to, stop being so woke. And it was an extraordinary spectacle. Those are people who have served for decades, and you could see them sitting there stone-faced. They didn't break that. But I think that it would not be surprising if they were just seething inside because of this guy who was, a junior officer lecturing them about how to do their jobs and acting as though, none of them know what they're doing. And that's how he has acted. Like I said, he's fired a bunch of people who were key personnel. And there's also a story here that I think we haven't heard the end of too, that there was a top commander who was basically in charge of the things that are going on now with all of these attacks on boats coming out of Venezuela, and he resigned. And we've never gotten the full story. He hasn't talked to the media. It seems logical to conclude that perhaps it was because he knew he was being asked to conduct an illegal operation and refused to do it. I hope that someday we'll find out that maybe he'll be subpoenaed to testify before Congress, and he can tell us what was really going on. But the attitude of this administration is the rules don't apply to us. The laws don't apply to us. We get to do what we want, and we get to kill who we want.
Well, this is the opposite of Teddy Roosevelt's, talk softly and carry a big stick. This guy talks loudly and used the stick on the wrong people. And the subtitle to your article, Paul Waldman, A Few Bad Men, is the Hegseth murder on the high seas scandal is only part of the story. This administration has put sadism at the heart of its policy and its politics. So let's talk about that, because it's not just Hegseth, it's Trump. You know, he's just labeled a whole country, its people, Somalis, as garbage today. And he regularly calls people from the third world animals. So doesn't this come from the top? And when you look at the top, the number two person in the power structure in the United States is the shadow whisperer, the co-president, Stephen Miller, who is manifestly cruel and driven by an unyielding hatred. And then all of the ICE activities, the way that they're breaking up families and beating up hapless immigrants who haven't broken the law, who are just trying to get, support their families. The cruelty is just pervasive in this administration. And many people I've talked to over the months now, they keep saying, yeah, cruelty is the point.
I think it is. Not only is that cruelty built into the policies, and it sometimes has an actual practical objective. I think they see this, and this really started in the first Trump administration with the family separation policy. Back then, the reporting we've gotten from inside the administration indicates that they saw that they wanted it to be visible. They wanted it to be as shocking as possible because they believed that if people saw, children being torn away from their parents and put in cages, that would provide a disincentive for people to immigrate to the country. And so I think that they want to make a show of being as cruel as possible for similar reasons. But they also want us, the American people, to delight in it. If you look at their social media feeds, they put out these very highly produced videos with lots of quick cuts and propulsive music and, showing Border Patrol and ICE busting down people's doors, throwing people to the ground, arresting them. And we're supposed to kind of thrill to it. It's supposed to give you a jolt of adrenaline. A lot of it is shot in first person, so you can see taken from a body cam. You can see the person holding a gun. That looks just like the perspective in a first-person shooter video game. They want you to be excited by this. And so they put out all this stuff on social media, with Kristi Noem, the Secretary of Homeland Security, kind of prancing around in front of these, in these different scenes. She's really kind of the star of the show. And they also have the other kind of side of their social media is a lot of, very sort of deep in the internet memes and jokes. And they want you alternatively to be thrilled by the cruelty and to think it's funny. And that's what, Pete Hegseth, his first reaction to the story that came out about him giving an order to kill everyone on those boats, he put out a tweet with this photoshopped image from the Franklin the Turtle books, with Franklin firing a rocket-propelled grenade on a boat with some people on it. And we're all supposed to laugh, and the administration is full of 4chan trolls and people who think that this is just hilarious and funny, and we should all laugh and we should all thrill to the cruelty, and that's how they want us to feel. But I think they're wrong about this. Yes, there is certainly an audience for that. And there are some people who are going to feel that way and react that way. But I don't think most people do. I think that most people don't want to be kind of their worst selves. They don't want to think that it's cool and funny to watch, a 10-year-old child weeping and sobbing uncontrollably because her mother just got kidnapped and shoved into a van and taken away from her. There may be some people who find that funny and cool, but I don't think most Americans do. And so I would hope that over time, as much damage as the policies do, that they are not going to convince people that this was a great thing to do.
Well, we've had enough examples, haven't we, Paul, of these 6 teenagers who spend all their time locked in their room playing these violent video games like Call of Duty. And incidentally, the guy that just shot the National Guardsman, one of whom died in Washington, he apparently spent the last year locked in his room playing video games like Call of Duty. So the idea that that kind of sickness is risen to the very top in the United States government is just appalling.
Yeah, and you can see it in their recruiting too. The Department of Homeland Security puts out these recruiting ads that are very similar. Lots of propulsive music, and shots of agents breaking down doors, and it says come join ICE, and you can do this too. And so they're kind of asking people to cross that border between the video games, which millions of people play and are perfectly well adjusted, and real life. And they say if you have been, playing those games, but you're yearning to actually do it, you actually want to beat people up, you actually want to kidnap people, come join ICE. And I think that is a problem that the next Democratic president is going to have to solve. That these agencies, especially the Border Patrol and ICE, are completely out of control, and they have hired thousands of dangerous people who are now in positions to put on masks and brutalize Americans and immigrants. And those people are going to have to be rooted out. I think that's going to be a real challenge for the next Democratic president.
Right, and the videos say that your job will be to protect our borders, but also to protect our culture. So how racist is that?
Yeah, there's a real kind of white supremacist philosophy of this administration that is just it's unadorned. If you look at the social media feeds of the Department of Homeland Security, other agencies like the Department of Labor, they have all of these images that some of them frankly look like they're right out of Nazi Germany, with these kind of Aryan looking illustrations of guys looking out over fields of green and saying things like protect your culture. Lots of scenes of white kids in sort of Norman Rockwell-esque scenes. And uh, and it's also reflected in policy. Like, for instance, right now the American asylum system has been cut off to every oppressed person in the world, with the exception of one group, and that is white South Africans. They are the only group of people whose suffering is apparently deep enough that they can be granted asylum in the United States. That is it. And Trump is now cutting off immigration to all sorts of non-white countries. And then he comes out and says that Somali Americans are garbage, and that, he talks about their country when he talks about these. And these are Americans he's talking about. Their country is America. But apparently, if you're not white, this is not really your country. And then you have kind of a more sophisticated version of that that's being advanced by J.D. Vance, where he keeps giving these speeches where he talks all about how the truest Americans are people who, trace their lineage back to the Civil War and before. And he has this whole kind of blood and soil conception of Americanness that even his own children would fail. Vance is a whole other subject we could get into and talk
Right.
about for an hour. But this is something that is going throughout the MAGA movement, that they are basically just taking the mask off, and they're no longer pretending that what they want is to have a thriving multiracial democracy. That in their view, America is for white people, and they may not say the word white when they talk about it, but that is the unequivocal message of everything that they're doing, both in their politics and their policy.
So just in closing, Paul, I mean, I've spoken to a lot of CIA and FBI counterintelligence people over the years, all of whom say that there's definitely a shadowy relationship between Trump and Putin. That so at the very, short of Trump basically taking orders from Putin, it's pretty clear that he admires Putin and wants to be like him. And the two things about Putin are that one, he's a massive kleptocrat who may be the richest man on the planet, having stolen his country blind, and Trump is doing everything he can to catch up to Putin. But he also seems to also admire Putin's cruelty. I mean, Putin is a psychopathic killer who rose to power by killing over 300 of his own citizens, and now he's taking pleasure in killing civilians in Ukraine, and even said on Thursday that he's going to fight the war till the last Ukrainian. So, is that a possibility that not only is Trump admiring Putin's kleptocracy and his wealth and feeling envious, but also admires his sadism?
I think so. And when, there have been many instances over the years where Trump has talked about some kind of act of repression that some government engaged in. and spoken of it with admiration. He talked about the Tiananmen Square massacre in China and said that, it was so strong and, extraordinary what the Chinese government did. And it was just such an amazing example of strength in action. And, you can't, when it comes to Putin, you can't divorce the violence that he exercises from the rest of the way he rules. And that's what Trump admires about him. He wants to be a ruler like that, whom everyone kowtows to. No one is able to question. And if anyone does question, well, they get tossed out a window. And, Trump sees that. And I think that he looks at how an American president has to act and the constraints that are on him in terms of the law and the separation of powers. And Trump says, I wish I could be like that. I wish I could do that to the people that I hate. I wish I could, rule without anybody questioning me. And his administration gives him the closest facsimile that they can, including these insane cabinet meetings where they go around the table and everyone has to offer the most abject, effusive praise of the dear leader that they can think of. And it's a comical spectacle, but I think it happens because the people around him know that that's what he wants. And so, they may not, in most of the time, be able to murder his enemies or, kill a journalist who writes a critical article. They may go out and insult them, but they know they can't toss them from a high window the way they do in Russia. So the best that they can offer their leader is to, tell him how he was delivered from God and that he is, has created the most extraordinary success that any American has ever experienced in 250 years and all that spectacle that we see. But if they could commit murder on his behalf, then I think a lot of them would probably do it.
Well, RFK Jr. is doing it via his crackpot medical misadvice, if that's the right word. Paul, I thank you so much for joining us. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks a lot.
And again, I've been speaking with Paul Waldman, who's a journalist and opinion writer whose work has appeared in dozens of newspapers, magazines, and digital outlets, including the Los Angeles Times, the Boston Globe, Chicago Tribune, The Week, MSNBC, and CNN. He's a former columnist at the Washington Post, and his books include Being Right Is Not Enough, What Progressives Must Learn from Conservative Success, The Press Effect, Politicians, Journalists, and the Stories That Shape the Political World, and most recently, White Rural Rage, The Threat to American Democracy, and he runs the cross section on Substack, where his latest article is A Few Bad Men. We're going to take a brief station break and back examining Putin's warning of going to war with Europe, after which the Russian dictator promised there would be no one left to negotiate with.
You're a monster, Mr. Grinch. Your heart's an empty hole. Your brain is full of spiders. You've got garlic in your soul, Mr. Grinch. I wouldn't touch you with a 39.5-foot pole. You're a vile one, Mr. Grinch.
Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Michael Kimmage, director of the Kennan Institute, who is a professor of history and department chair at the Catholic University of America. From 2014 to 2017, he served on the Secretary's policy planning staff at the United States Department of State, where he held the Russia-Ukraine portfolio. He's the author of The Abandonment of the West, A History of an Idea in American Foreign Policy, and Collisions, The War in Ukraine and the Origins of the New Global Instability. And he has a recent article at Foreign Policy, Europe is at War. Welcome to Background Briefing, Michael Kimmage.
Great to be back with you, Ian.
Well, thanks for joining us. And yesterday, President Vladimir Putin was speaking to a group of journalists at an investment forum in Moscow, and he was asked a question by a reporter about remarks on the Russian media that Hungary's foreign minister had made, saying that Europe was preparing a war against Russia. And Putin said that Russia didn't want a war with Europe, and then to quote him, he said, "If Europe suddenly wants to start a war with us and starts it, then it would end so swiftly for Europe that Russia would have no one left to negotiate with. So that's pretty bone-chilling. I'm also astounded that I shouldn't be, I suppose, given the nature of Orban, that the foreign minister of Hungary would say something like that. But what do you make of this, Michael?
Well, I mean, there's an element of Putin bluster to this, and since the start of the war, Putin has attempted to intimidate the Europeans in particular with threats of nuclear war, nuclear escalation, and such. I don't think it means that Russia has a plan to do this anytime soon or as a discrete outlining of Russian actions. And in a legal sense, Europe and Russia are not at war with one another, which Putin well knows. But, verbal escalation does have some bearing on other kinds of escalation potentially. And if you do wind the clock back to February 2022, what you see is that across the span of time, the war itself and the language around the war has gotten more intense, and that's the trajectory that we're on.
But what's going on with the Hungarians? Why is their foreign minister stirring the pot with provocative and completely inaccurate statements?
Well, there are lots of people who make those kinds of statements across the political spectrum. I don't know if they're really statements of policy, maybe more statements of sentiment. And of course, Viktor Orban has met often with Putin in recent years, and Hungary is a country that rhetorically claims that it wants to see a quick end to the war. But, Hungary is a part of the European structure, and as such, Hungary is a supporter of Ukraine in the war. It's certainly not on the Russian side, and so it may just be an indication that for many Hungarians, their feelings about the war are European feelings and not, sort of outlier Hungarian feelings.
But isn't the opposite true, Michael, that the Europeans aren't sufficiently defending Ukraine? I mean, there's a very plaintive article in the New York Times by Ukraine's foreign minister, Dmitry Kuleba, titled, "Where is the Will to Win in Ukraine?" that more or less points out that Ukraine is about to be abandoned or has been abandoned by the United States, and that Europe has to step up, and it's not clear that Europe is doing it. So the notion that Europe is at war with Russia, I'm sure the Ukrainians would like them not so much to be at war, but at least to help out a little bit.
Well, help out a little bit is that is the status quo. You have now a commitment on Germany's part to some €500 billion of spending on defense, and many countries are spending in the tens of millions, or in some cases in the billions, to support Ukraine, and that's been the case since the outbreak of the war in February 2022. And it is also the case that by doing so, Europe is incurring all kinds of risks by funneling weapons into Ukraine at wartime. So I think it would be inaccurate to say that Europe is out of the picture or fading away, or even doing a moderate amount to support Ukraine. Europe is doing a lot, but there are distinct areas in which Europe is falling behind, and drone production would be one of them. And the defense industrial story of this war is just difficult to fathom in a way because Europe is so much richer in aggregate than Russia is, and yet Russia outproduces and in some respects outperforms Europe on the battlefield.
And the Russians apparently have been using drones now with fiber optics, which can't be intercepted. And the advantage that Ukraine had for a while with drones apparently has switched to the other side.
That's correct. Yeah, the first part of 2025, Ukraine did have an advantage in drone warfare. Russia has caught up and is outpacing Ukraine for the moment. Although in that regard, you have to say that the war goes back and forth, and that was true when it was more of an artillery war at the beginning. It's true now that it's become a kind of artillery and drone war, and it's not inconceivable that 3 months from now, 4 months from now, we could be speaking about a Ukrainian advantage. So Russia is an inch ahead, but not a mile ahead.
So, what can we say about the United States? I mean, it seems to be behaving in a shameful way. And Putin kept Jared Kushner and Witkoff waiting for an hour. Then the other day, they had a 5 hour meeting, after which they came out empty handed, even though a couple of the Russian officials said things aren't that bad and maybe something will happen later. I think Lavrov said something along those lines as well. So why is Trump and Vance and company abandoning Ukraine at this moment?
Well, the U.S. is not abandoning Ukraine. The U.S. provides targeting and intelligence assistance to Ukraine, which is meaningful for the prosecution of the war. And the U.S. is providing weaponry which Europeans are paying for. And so it's not as if the U.S. has pulled out. But to get to the heart of your question, Ian, what's very difficult to understand about the U.S. approach is the incredible haste. So there was a sense of an ultimatum that was supposed to be Thanksgiving last week for an end to the conflict. Various reports going back to the Alaska summit in September between Presidents Trump and Putin of a breakthrough. Secretary and National Security Advisor Rubio said that there was a breakthrough in Miami about 10 days ago. And there's this rush that Washington has to accomplish something diplomatically, and clearly the Russians are taking advantage of that and exploiting that desire for a quick win to spin out these prolonged meetings that yield nothing. And it's very difficult to know what the benchmarks are for the U.S. They seem to change. Sometimes it's a ceasefire, sometimes it's an end to the conflict, sometimes it's Ukrainian victory. And it's very hard to know what the Trump administration's agenda is in this, where they wish to go with all of this diplomacy. So, the U.S. has some leverage in the situation. It's clearly using it, and definitely Trump and high-level officials are using their bully pulpits, but they're not getting anywhere. And that's just bizarre in a sense. It's maybe not so bizarre that they're not getting anywhere, but it's bizarre that with these approaches, they expect to get tangible results.
But haven't they noticed that Putin isn't apparently not interested in peace? He wants victory. And short of victory, he wants a diplomatic deal that would essentially cripple and neuter Ukraine. So why doesn't our side recognize the obvious?
It's hard for me to answer for an administration that on this issue is often opaque and that changes its explanations of what it's doing, its theory of the case so often. There's not, an extensive array of expertise in the Trump administration, so I don't know what their baseline assumptions are about Putin's motivations or Putin's expectations. So that could be a source of inaccuracy. I have the impression that President Trump very much has his own timeline for this, which is perhaps about domestic American politics, that he wants to add this to what he understands to be a long string of victories on the diplomatic front, and he may be looking at that storyline and talking himself into it, as opposed to taking a close look at what Putin is up to, and recognizing, as the logic of your question suggests, that this is just not a time when Russians are compromising. If anything, Russia is pushing further forward with the war itself. But we've been in this circle, this kind of merry-go-round since January 2025 of expectations of some kind of improvement diplomatically, and yet no improvement in the hand, and we're seemingly unable to get out of this cycle.
So, is there a problem with too many cooks in the kitchen here, with Driscoll doing one thing, Rubio another, Witkoff another, Jared Kushner another, and Trump? I'm not sure how much he's coordinating it. Is that a problem, that we don't have a kind of chain of command here in terms of negotiating?
I don't know enough about the inner circle to say, and it's not unusual to have an administration that pulls in a lot of different directions on a big issue. I think that the fundamental problem here is that U.S. leverage is limited. And in some ways, the Trump administration is diminishing its leverage by withdrawing from the conflict, not fully, but up to a point. And the U.S. is also diminishing its leverage by not consulting with its European partners and allies, which would augment American power if there were such consultation. So Trump is presenting himself as the major deal maker. That's maybe not surprising when you know the personality of President Trump. He's putting himself at the center of the diplomatic process, but he has limited leverage, and he's taking some of that leverage out of his own hands. And for reasons that are hard for everyone to explain, the Trump administration refuses more or less to up the ante and put increasing pressure on Russia, which would be another form of leverage. So they negotiate one of the biggest conflicts in the 21st century without the tools to get big results. And at the same time, they don't change the tactics of negotiating or change the tools. And so it's a feeling of encountering the same problem over and over and over again.
So just in the last couple of minutes then, Michael, one of the obvious pieces of leverage would be to allow the Ukrainians to fire deeper into Russia and to give them more offensive support so that Putin would be hurt more and the Russian people would be hurt more, and because they're free to destroy Ukraine, and apparently you can't do the same to Russia. That's always been an asymmetry. And the other aspect is, I don't know whether it's wishful thinking on the part of Western analysts, that somehow the oligarchs are all going to gang up on Putin and get rid of him because he's such a disaster. What do you think of these possibilities?
Well, no, I don't think that Putin is in any visible danger. Anything could happen. There was a mutiny in the first year of the war, so you wouldn't want to be too wedded to the status quo in Russia. But there's no indication of a change in that regard. And the oligarchs, such as they are still, are all completely subordinate to Putin. Of course, there have been moments when the Trump administration has considered supplying Tomahawk weapons to Ukraine, contributing to strikes in Russia. The U.S. did just raise sanctions on a few Russian gas and oil companies. The U.S. has put pressure on India not to buy Russian gas and oil. So there have been pressure tactics over the last couple of months, but they're very episodic and very, very far from comprehensive. And I suspect that that's just how it's going to be. That's the path that the Trump administration doesn't want to go down, of putting greater pressure on Russia. They could. It's not that there's anything standing in their way, but they choose not to. And at the same time, they can't compel Ukraine to surrender, and they can't just move past all of the ways that Europe continues to support Ukraine. So it's stuck. The whole process is stalemated, and some kind of value. Let's imagine a collapse in Russia, a big change in U.S. policy, a big change in Europe. Some kind of variable could cause this to get unstuck. But my suspicion is that this is a situation that will be stuck for quite a while.
Well, Michael Kimmage, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
Thank you as ever, Ian. Great to be with you.
Well, thank you, Michael. Again, I've been speaking with Michael Kimmage, who's the director of the Kennan Institute, who's a professor of history and department chair at the Catholic University of America from 2014 to 2017. He served on the Secretary's policy planning staff at the United States Department of State, where he held the Russia-Ukraine portfolio. He's the author of The Abandonment of the West, The History of an Idea in American Foreign Policy, and Collisions, The War in Ukraine and the Origins of the New Global Instability. And he has a recent article at Foreign Policy, Europe is at War. We're going to take a brief station break and back look into the possibility of peace between Israelis and Palestinians in spite of the ongoing atrocities in Gaza, where there is supposed to be a peace process underway. Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Sarah Lee Whitson, the Executive Director of Dawn, an organization that seeks to support democracy and human rights in the Middle East. She was formerly the Executive Director of Human Rights Watch's Middle East and North Africa Division, where she oversaw work in 19 countries. And her latest book with Michael Omerman, just out, is From Apartheid to Democracy, A Blueprint for Peace in Israel-Palestine. Welcome to Background Briefing, Sarah Lee Whitson.
Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for joining us. And the fact that you've written this book with a blueprint of how the Palestinians and the Israelis can achieve peace and beyond that, live together in this otherwise painful, horrible situation, which we've all been witnessing now for the last few years, obviously to many seems chimeric, but you've really laid out a serious blueprint here. But let's just start at the present there, where we supposedly have a peace deal. But according to Amnesty International, Israel's genocide against the Palestinians in Gaza continues unabated despite the ceasefire. So where do we stand?
Well, that's entirely accurate because while there is a ceasefire on paper, first of all, the Israeli military actions against Palestinians continue daily. The number of Palestinians killed, including approximately half of them children, I believe, since the so-called ceasefire is now over 350 people. Just overnight, I believe 4 more Palestinians were killed by Israeli forces. Israeli forces continue to occupy a large swath, half of Gaza, and most significantly, it continues to forcibly displace Palestinians from their homes, from their cities, from their towns, in a genocidal attempt to remove them from their homeland.
And this is going on the West Bank, I assume you're referring to.
Well, specifically, I'm referring in terms of the ceasefire to Gaza.
Right.
The forced displacement of Palestinians in a tiny swath of Gaza is part of the forced displacement process. They are not free to return to their homes, and they are being forcibly kept in unlivable conditions designed to make them all want to leave Gaza entirely. On top of that, we have, of course, the daily incursions, daily attacks, daily destruction of Palestinian towns and villages in the West Bank, where I think we can fairly expect to see a much more wide-scale broadening of Israeli operations. Netanyahu announced today that he intends to recognize or legalize some so-called illegal outposts, a specific commitment he had made to the Emiratis as part of their Abraham Accords not to do. Yet another promise broken by Netanyahu. Of course, he doesn't care. But the reality is that Israel is aggressively, hungrily trying to occupy and ultimately annex more and more Palestinian land in the West Bank, squeezing Palestinians into smaller and smaller areas where they can live.
So when you say Israel is doing it, Netanyahu, of course, is running the country, and he has this far-right coalition that seems to be, I don't know whether the tail that wags the dog, but the right wing in Israel has never really enunciated what their end game is, but it should be clear to anybody that their end game is to make life so miserable for the Palestinians that somehow they're going to slink off into Jordan or into Egypt or somewhere else. And those policies seem to be in play, both in Gaza and the West Bank. So where is the rest of Israel? In other words, in terms of your blueprint for peace between these two peoples that have been at each other's throats now for decades?
Well, two things. First of all, the current polling among Israeli Jewish citizens shows really overwhelming support for the genocide in Gaza and for the atrocities that are being committed in the West Bank. I think that whatever camp of peace supporters that may have existed in Israel some decades ago under the guise of the Oslo Process two-state solution has completely evaporated. But you're right, our book is predicated on the consent of Israeli Jews and Palestinians to a new future and a new reality. And we are not at that moment yet where Israelis are looking for a different future, a different reality, because they are able to continue to enjoy impunity and relative peace and security with the support of the United States. But those circumstances are changing. They're changing in the United States. Support for Israel is at an all-time low. American political candidates are running for office on a platform that's predicated on refusing to take money from AIPAC, refusing to support weapons for Israel. There are global sanctions that are being imposed against Israel. And at some point, should Israelis consider that they do not want to be ostracized by the entire planet, that they do not want to live in a permanent war footing, that they do not want to have their sons and daughters permanently subjugated to military conscription, then we are trying to offer an off-ramp. And we think part of the problem, part of the challenge why there has been no movement since the failed Oslo process is because there is no alternative plan. There is no alternative blueprint. There is no practical hope for the future. And that's what we're trying to provide. We're trying to contribute to a different course, to choosing a different course in Israel-Palestine by demonstrating in our practical, detailed map how we can deconstruct apartheid and occupation and create the groundwork for democratic decision-making.
So, Sarah, the constituency in Israel for peace that was pretty strong back in the days of Rabin and Oslo, and it's been weakened over the years. And, it's worth noting, of course, that Rabin was murdered by a right-winger, and his widow, Leah, always blamed Netanyahu for her husband's death. And Netanyahu, of course, has been the longest-serving Israeli prime minister and is in charge to this day. So there's been a gradual, diminution of the peace constituency or the coexistence constituency. Bill Clinton at one point suggested that the country's moved to the right inexorably because of the immigrants coming from the Soviet Union. It's made it a more right-wing country. But I assume that the October 7th attack on Israel by Hamas has really negatively impacted the peace movement in Israel. In other words, did the Israeli people just after October 7th, is there any trust left in a Palestinian partner?
Well, at this moment, it's not about trust in Palestinian partner. It's about impunity. It's about the Israeli government supported by a sizable percentage of the Israeli population, trying to achieve what they want, which is taking all the Palestinian lands and pushing Palestinians out. That route and that option is one that is currently available to them because of the support of the United States. That support may not exist. And this is why we are also trying to find an alternative pathwork, because we are hopeful that enough Israelis will say, actually, we don't want to be a genocidal state. We don't want to expel and murder every last Palestinian from these lands. And people can have very extreme views in one year and the next year have peace and live side by side. History is rife with dramatic changes that have upended things that seemed impossible to upend, whether it's the fall of the Berlin Wall, whether it's the collapse of the Soviet Union, whether it's the end of apartheid in South Africa, whether it's the end of slavery in the United States. Things change and people can come together. The politics is what matters. Giving people reasonable, rational political choices does matter. And that's what we're trying to offer up.
And another example, of course, is Northern Ireland, right?
And of course, Northern Ireland. And the book is actually predicated on studying examples of political transition around the world, both successful and unsuccessful. And that is what led us to our insights of why Oslo had failed and why we think our plan is better. One of the reasons for that is that we prioritize ending Israeli crimes of occupation and apartheid and creating a democratic groundwork for decision-making ahead of questions of governance. The notion of the Oslo process was that these Israeli crimes would end only if there was a negotiated solution about governance and statehood for Israelis and Palestinians. We think that was a wrong approach. The right approach, the mandatory approach under international law, which is what guides every step of the blueprint, is to end crimes unconditionally. And that's what we aim to do. The second thing we do is that we do not allow unelected representatives, corrupt representatives, criminal representatives to make decisions on behalf of Israelis and Palestinians as if they're two flat monolithic blocks, but rather engage every human being living between the river and the sea to participate and decide democratically how they wish to be governed in one state or two states, confederation, binational, and so forth. And that is also a significant break from the failed Oslo process. Decisions about governance should be made by the people who are being governed. It has to be by the will of the governed, and that is what we're trying to ensure. But first, we have to end the Israeli crimes of apartheid and occupation.
So what gives you hope then, Sarah?
Well, I mean, what gives me hope is that I have seen good things happen over the course of the planet. And I believe that hope is a practice and hope is a project and hope is work. I believe that we have to contribute the building blocks of hope, creating alternative visions, creating utopias that give people something to grasp onto, something to hold on to of how the world can be better.
So at this moment, the so-called peace in Gaza, given the nature of the Trump regime, and particularly the role of Jared Kushner, we just saw what happened in Moscow, where he and Witkoff showed up at the Kremlin. Putin kept them waiting for an hour, and then 5 hours later they came up with nothing. But clearly what they were talking about there is not so much a peace deal, with the Ukrainians not even in the mix, is a business deal where Putin will reward Trump with, $1 trillion or whatever if he can get him off the hook in Ukraine. It's similarly, that seems to be the plan in Gaza, right? It's a real estate deal.
I mean, it is certainly from their eyes and from their perspectives a real estate deal. And certainly what we've seen Trump offer up are effectively visions of victor's justice, whether in Ukraine and Russia, whether between Azerbaijan and Armenia, and of course now the so-called peace plan for Gaza. These are ultimately dictating terms of victor's justice. The Palestinians had no say in crafting or drafting the so-called 20-point plan that is now intending to put Gaza under foreign tutelage, under foreign control. I actually don't disagree that a lot of these motivations and issues can be addressed by thinking about the political and economic motivations that lead political leaders to take actions. And I do believe that for many people, economic security and physical security are actually their paramount concerns. And so our blueprint takes those matters very, very seriously. And we have devised a 3-year plan that prioritizes security for the people living between the river and the sea and staggers decision-making on things like restorative justice, reparations, the return of refugees, because we do believe that we have to offer a practical, viable plan that while it is going to be transformative, also takes steps to ensure security and stability, economic security and stability, and physical security and stability.
So, Sarah, could you tell our listeners why your book is important and why it will add to their understanding, their activism, and do what you're suggesting? The blueprint's there, but people have got to join in and take the steps.
Well, first of all, thank you. That's amazing and wonderful to hear. I would say there are 2 reasons you should read our book. Number one, it is a radical act of imagination and hope. And we are in short supply of imagination and hope. And I think envisioning a different future, really building out a different future, a way that our future can be different, is important, not just for Israel-Palestine, but with so many of the intractable, seemingly hopeless issues that we're facing all around us, at home, in our cities, in our towns, in our climate, in our planet. And I really invite people to engage in that kind of work of imagination and hope. And second, I think it's actually a very practical, viable, and detailed plan for those who are interested in peace and conflict resolution. It should be interesting to see how we try to approach the many, many issues that plague Israel-Palestine from a new perspective and a new approach that breaks with past failed approaches to peace and conflict resolution. Envisioning the future we want to see is a necessary element for getting the future we want to see. And that's what we're trying to do here.
Well, Sarah Lee Whitson, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
Thank you for having me.
And again, I've been speaking with Sarah Lee Whitson, who's the Executive Director of Dawn, an organization that seeks to support democracy and human rights in the Middle East. She was formerly the executive director of Human Rights Watch's Middle East and North Africa division, where she oversaw work in 19 countries. And her latest book with Michael Omerman, just out, is From Apartheid to Democracy, A Blueprint for Peace in Israel-Palestine. And this has been Background Briefing. I'm Ian Masters, and I'd like to thank producers Graham Fitzgibbon, Asher Price, and Sasha Linden-Cohen. If you missed any of today's program and would like to explore our vast archives, you can find us at backgroundbriefing.org, where we include extended interviews, searchable by topic, and have made it easier for you to sign up for daily email updates and provide links to resources, articles, and books discussed on the program. Also, you can find links there to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and we highly encourage your ratings and reviews on these platforms. Find us on Twitter, Blue Sky, and Facebook at Ian Masters Media, and our new social media manager, Luke Susswood, is also posting highlights from the show on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram at Ian Masters Media. So please do help us reach more listeners by sharing this program with friends, family, and colleagues. And to help sustain this program into the future and ensure it remains free to all, please take a moment to support us by going to backgroundbriefing.org/donate and/or at publictruthmedia.org, where your tax-deductible donations, large and small, keep us broadcasting. And I'll be back tomorrow with another Background Briefing at backgroundbriefing.org. Bye for now.